Welcome back to this week's recording of the Across the Sky podcast, which is put on by Lee Enterprises and the Lee Weather Team. Lee Enterprises is a national publication company with over 70 publications nationwide, and our weather team of meteorologists covers it from coast to coast each day. On the team, we have myself, Kirsten Lang, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Matt Holliner in the Midwest, Joe Martucci in Atlantic City, and Sean Sublett in Richmond, Virginia. Welcome back, guys. Hope everyone has had a wonderful week. You know, this is our first podcast where we're actually going to dive into a question or a comment, in this case, from a listener. And I want to note that this was made after we talked about the Arizona heat and how hot it had been for days on end. Deirdre wrote in, and she had more of a comment kind of question about this. And she said, "Hello, I'm a bit confused about the hype about the heat this summer. We visited Arizona in July of 2005, and every day was between 115 and 120 degrees. We were traveling in an RV that had no AC in the cab, so I'm well aware of how hot that is, but locals told us that this is what summer is like in the Arizona desert, and it wasn't just a spike. The high heat continued for well over a month, so why is this year suddenly different?"
Yeah, so I thought that was a really interesting point. So I wanted to go back and look at the data from July of 2005. And when I did, I saw that her information wasn't very accurate. I mean, it's always hot in July in Phoenix. I mean, that's what Arizona is known for, and especially that time of year. But I went back and looked at the high temperatures. They were generally between 105 and 110. Again, not cool by any stretch. But the hottest temperature all that month was 116, and it only happened once. So I think the big deal for this past July was that every single day was above normal for Phoenix. I mean, every day, no break at all, where there were several days when it was quote unquote only 101, 102, 103 in Phoenix, which is a couple of degrees below normal. I think that's the key here, is that every single day was hotter than normal and above 110, which is without precedent in Phoenix. I think that really is what got everybody's attention. And, and to that point, Matt, I know you and I were talking about this also. When she says 115 to 120, where is she taking that? She said in the cab. I mean, and if that's the case, that's another whole thing, right?
Yeah, so that's what got us thinking, like, well, why did she think it was between 115 and 120 every day? Like, where is she getting that data from? And so our best guess, we don't know this for sure, is that she was probably looking at, even in 2005, a lot of vehicles have thermometers, or the RVs have thermometers in the car, and they give you a temperature reading, the outside temperature reading. People look at that all the time. I get pictures all the time from back home. People say, look how cold it is, or look how hot it is, and a picture of the thermometer on their dashboard or on their rear view mirror, looking at that temperature. But the problem is, though it's a very easy way to see what the temperature is outside, those thermometers on cars are not very accurate, and it has a lot to do with the location, where they're placed. And you'll also notice how quickly the temperature will change on those thermometers versus being parked versus moving. So they're not a very good representation of what actually was occurring, the real temperatures. And so that's why we got the perfect guy to come on and talk about how to take accurate temperature readings. What's the best way to get accurate data? What is used to feed our computer models that are making these forecasts, and how there's so many issues when it comes to taking accurate temperature readings. And so why not bring on the guy in charge of the Oklahoma Mesonet, and we get into the details of why it's such a great network and how we can expand it to more locations in the country. So this is a great episode.
Yeah, shout out to Deirdre, because without her, we wouldn't be doing this episode. So Deirdre, if you're listening, thanks for listening, and thanks for, having such an interest in the weather here. We appreciate you giving us the opportunity to talk more about temperature readings and what is accurate, what isn't, and how we can go forward with somebody who knows a lot about temperature readings, because in the weather world, the Oklahoma Mesonet is a very, very big deal. So thanks again, Deirdre, for the question and the comment.
All right, so on the other side of that break, we are going to have Dr. Kevin Kloesel. He'll be on here to talk with us more about this topic. Well, welcome, Dr. Kevin Kloesel. He is the director of the Oklahoma Climate Survey, which operates the Oklahoma Mesonet Weather Observation Network. and he's also the university meteorologist for the Oklahoma University Department of Campus Safety, and is responsible for providing weather forecasts and safety information to the campus of OU, which is right up the street from me here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So welcome, Dr. Kloesel. How are you doing today?
Doing well. It's good to see everybody.
Well, we are excited to have you on. And, we wanted to talk with you about a couple of things. We're actually going to start with a topic that came across to us from a listener about temperature readings. What we wanted to do is that, a lot of people may not realize that there's really a strict protocol for measurement on temperature. And we wanted to see if first you could chat with us a little bit about that and kind of tell us what that protocol might be.
The temperature thing is really, really a struggle, right? Because so many people are exposed to temperature in different ways, right? When they see it on TV as a broadcaster, that temperature is likely the official temperature at a recording site with calibrated instrumentation. And it may be, 99, but at your place, you have a thermometer in the backyard and it was 105 today, right? Man, I was way hotter than that. Or you drove to the grocery store and the bank is saying 112. Or like just yesterday, I walk out onto an artificial turf football field at Norman High School here in central Oklahoma, and it is 177 on the turf, right? So how can it be 177, 112, 105, 99, all literally in the same place? And it just comes down to instrumentation, right? And exposure. And it's very important to know that all of those temperatures are valid, right? Because if we're dealing with heat injuries and possibly heat illness with a football team, that 177 is real, right? That is a real temperature in sunshine on a football field where they're about to play. But the 99, which was the official observation, is the only way to really say, okay, what are we doing with the air that is going by without really regard to all of these different surfaces that are underneath it? So you do it in a sheltered environment, you do it in an environment where the breeze is going through. That instrument is calibrated, and then you hope to have a whole lot of those around so that you can actually see what the ambient temperature patterns look like, because that information is vitally important to prediction. So putting that into our weather forecast models to kind of understand, if we started putting all of these 177s and 112s and all of those into our weather models, they'd never be able to handle that. We wouldn't be able to resolve the big picture of what weather is doing. And so those like the Mesonet, for example, you've already mentioned, that ability to calibrate and make sure that the temperature in the panhandle can be compared to the temperature in Southeast Oklahoma, that's incredibly important to doing research both in the climate realm and in the weather forecasting realm.
Hey, Kevin, it's Joe. So, you said calibration earlier, right? A properly calibrated thermometer. Could you explain what that is and what the protocols are for that?
Oh my gosh, yes. And it's elaborate, right? Every one of our sensors in the Mesonet has a life history, a life story associated with it. Literally, it's biography. And so at the National Weather Center on the OU campus in Norman, we have a laboratory with what are called calibration chambers. And these are to national standards. So when you have a national standard device that is reading 70, then you want to make sure that every instrument you put in it is also reading 70 before you put it out in the field. If anybody's ever gone to Walmart or a box store and looked at the temperatures in the garden center, right, the thermometers, you get your pick, right? You can lay out all the thermometers in the garden center, and one's reading 84, one's reading 82, one's reading 81, one's reading, they're all different. And it's like, okay, do I want the hot one? Do I want the cold one? Which one do I want, right? But there's no guarantee that any of them are correct. So what we do is we go through an elaborate, it's a set of standards, and those set of standards are applied to each instrument. And just dirty little secret here, we love our instrument providers, but we don't believe anything anybody tells us, right? They can tell us that it's calibrated to a certain this, we don't believe it, right? The Mesonet is, we do it ourselves, we do our calibrations ourselves, and that way we know that if we have an entire state full of 72-degree readings, that it is 72 at every one of those sites, not 71, not 69, whatever it is. And that elaborate going through that testing. And then what you do, you take it way up, and you take it way down. And does that thermometer still perform, right? Does it perform all the way up to 115 and 120? And does it meet the standard there? And does it all the way, to 0 and -5 and -10? And does it meet the standard there? So it's not just a single temperature calibration, right? It is against an entire scale of readings within that standard chamber that then becomes the basis for us to be able to say, you know what? If the temperature changed in the average for a half a degree over 30 years, that you can take to the bank, right? Because we know that each of those instruments are calibrated, not like the one I have in my backyard, right? Which is reading 107 right now, right? And it's like, okay, it's probably 107 where the thermometer is, but did that drift? I never calibrated that thermometer. And that's the big issue with bank thermometers. And, you don't know how they've been calibrated, or if it's against a standard, or whether somebody chose the second one from the right at the Walmart instead of the fourth one from the right, even though they were different when you bought them. So those are the things that we have to eliminate, because it's about trust, right? You guys know this, man, we get clobbered. If you utter the word climate, you get clobbered, and it's very real. And if we are going to say this is what the data show, we better be able to back it up. Because if somebody can say, oh, well, you changed the location, right? You changed the location of your sensor. And if we did, then we've ruined the data for that location. So it's a little bit like real estate, right? Location, 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 and then making sure that all of your instruments are calibrated. Back in COVID, right? Oh my gosh, those little handheld things that you go across your head with those. Oh, we had so much fun with those at the Mesonet, because I could figure out that I was running a fever and not a fever simultaneously, depending upon which one I picked up. And you can't go on that, right? It's why you see those blood pressure machines in the hospital, they better be calibrated. You can't have drift, because you've got a physician making a life and death decision based upon that information. And we do and take the same care with the instrumentation we have at the Mesonet.
And Kevin, I think it's a little bit of discouraging for people who are listening to this. It's like, gosh, I thought I could trust my backyard thermometer. So for people, and some people may not care about, how close exactly, but I know some people do. They would really want an accurate thermometer. They want the closest thing, to an accurate temperature as possible. So do you have any recommendations for when people go shopping for a thermometer? Or is there anything that people can look for to be like, oh, I can trust this thermometer a little bit more when they're standing there at Home Depot trying to decide on a thermometer? Do you have any recommendations as far as buying a home thermometer?
Absolutely. While you're standing at a Home Depot looking at those thermometers, download the Mesonet app. And then if you've got the Mesonet app, now you've got statewide calibrated thermometers in every county, and you can look at that map and take that to the bank. That's a little self-serving, but there are some really good devices that are out there, and you can kind of read the reviews, and every year there's new toys, right? Particularly for the meteorology hobbyist community. But again, hobbyist community, if you're interested in a temperature in your backyard, then, buy what you think is the right thing for you, right? I don't know that I have any better advice than that. There are some really expensive solutions, and there are really inexpensive solutions, but it's going to be all about where you put it, where you site it. Is it in the shade? Is it in the sun? Is it on your roof? Is it on your shed? And all of those are going to make a difference. And I've got 15 of these in my backyard, and they're never reading the same thing.
Well, let's go back to the sighting bit, because that matters so much. In my yard, I have a little Tempest, and we have a very well shaded canopy, and I cannot count on this at all for wind because of that. It does okay because it's shaded with regard to temperature. But talk about some of the sighting challenges, whether it's Mesonet, whether it's the FAA stuff, whether it's the AWASs, the older generation, in terms of trying to get the most accurate air temperature possible. How should you position in terms of distance off the ground, open space? Can you speak to those points a little bit?
Right. And some of that is application based, right? So we have a number of agricultural providers where they're interested in the temperature near the ground or even in the ground, right? So we take just as many soil temperature readings as we do air temperature readings for growers, producers, ranchers, those kinds of things. And so sighting sometimes is based upon the application. If you are, looking at air temperature, usually that's human head height, right? Something pretty close to 6 feet. We have, instruments that are higher up. We have that for different applications in the state of Oklahoma. And so the sighting is going to depend on what you're going to need it for. And what we do with our Mesonet sites is we make sure that each and every one of them are sited with the exact same standards and the same guidelines. So same underlying ground conditions, same distance away from trees or blocking buildings or whatever the case may. We've had to remove sites because there have been in Oklahoma, we've got this industry that's really coming up quick that likes to put out big, huge tents and grow nice green plants in them. And those have been a struggle for us because when you put those big green tents and those, or the big white tents with the green plants in them, and you get them really close to Mesonet sites, it changes the dew point, it changes the temperature, it essentially ruins the climate record, and we have to decommission that site. And so we've had that issue in some places.
All right, well, Dr. Kloesel, we're going to come back with you after this break here in just a short minute.
Michael J. for Hope for the Warriors. Started back in '06 at Camp Lejeune. Military families witnessing the effects of war on their loved ones. Now, almost 20 years later, they've aided over 53,000 service members, veterans, and families with confidential, high-quality behavioral health care services at little or no cost to post 9/11 vets and their families. Over 91% of every dollar donated goes directly to the programs. If you're as concerned about our heroes as I am, go to hopeforthewarriors.org.
And welcome back to the Across the Sky podcast. I'm Kirsten Lang alongside Matt Holliner, Joe Martucci, and John Sublett. And we have Dr. Kevin Kloesel on with us today. And, we were just talking a little bit about temperature readings, but I wanted to get into something that we were talking about or that you were discussing a lot throughout your answers is the Oklahoma Mesonet. Tell us a little bit about that program and kind of the backstory on it.
30 years ago, there were scientists at Oklahoma State University that were working on agriculture. That's their calling card at OSU, and needing additional weather information to do a better job for farmers, ranchers, producers, growers, you name it. While at the same time, we were having issues like the Tulsa flood. And the Tulsa flood led the National Weather Service, and at the time, Ken Crawford, who was at the Weather Service, to think that, if we had just more rainfall observations, we might have been able to forecast and reduce loss of life in the Tulsa flood. And so there were two groups of people both talking about a weather network. And what was amazing is that through just almost good luck, right, as many do, Ron Elliott at Oklahoma State University and Ken Crawford at the Weather Service, who had recently moved to the University of Oklahoma to be the director of the climate survey at the time, started talking and said, you know what? All these other states, they have a forestry network, they have a transportation network, they have all these different disparate networks to do different things. What if we in Oklahoma used one network to meet the needs of all of these stakeholders? So they brought in agriculture and forestry and emergency management and the Weather Service and university researchers and people working on climate and weather, and said, what would we like to have? And we put all of that in one network. So there's at least one in every county. We have 120 of those across the state. We have a calibration lab at Norman at the National Weather Center where we do all of the technical work. We have a research team. We have an outreach team. We provide the data to teachers. We provide the data to emergency managers, to the forestry, to ag, to fire, to all of those various stakeholders. And it has been, we are so lucky over 3 decades to have the support from every governor along the way, from Henry Bellman on to Kevin Stitt, who just signed our legislation into law. Again, we have to go defend what we do and re-up like all the other agencies do. But we've been at this for 30 years. It is the preeminent. The American Association for the Advancement of Science called it the gold standard. And now we've got copycats, right? We've got other state networks throughout the country that are all working towards what we hope to be someday a national Mesonet, so that we can do a much better job predicting weather and doing the monitoring, right, across all types of hazards.
Yeah, I was going to ask, in terms of building a Mesonet, right? I mean, you talk about funding. It is something that does require financial, commitment. What do you guys do in terms of public outreach to let people know that, hey, we're in Oklahoma, we have a Mesonet here. I'm in New Jersey. We have a Mesonet that's really good, not as good as you guys, but really good. So what do you do in terms of just letting people know, throughout the state that, hey, this is what we're going on and this is the value it provides you?
So we have a very robust web presence, which provides data every 5 minutes across the board. And so the public loves it. We do it for irrigation planning, for landscape companies, for how long concrete needs to cure, for a construction company, for emergency managers, for EMSA, for law enforcement, and the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation for forensic investigations after the fact. I mean, every imaginable place we can find a place to put our weather information, we are usually at their front door. And so we go out. I mean, it is a door-to-door grassroots campaign, going to agencies, going and training them how to use it, right? That's equally important. You don't just throw data in somebody's hand and let them use it. That would be like Brent Venables throwing a football out on the field and say, hey, go to it, right? And then you expect to have success. It doesn't work that way. So there's an extensive training program that goes on. COVID forced us into developing online training modules, and that's actually really helped us out because it's allowed us to reach places that maybe we didn't think we could reach before. So between the gold standard of how we do our calibration and how we maintain the efficiency, as well as our 99.999 ability to bring weather data into the hands of people that need it, we also spend a significant amount of time in local jurisdictions, in county courthouses, in VOTECs, in schools, in, EOCs, you name it, across the board, to train people how to use it as well. We're thrilled that we're turning 30 in 2024, and we will definitely celebrate that.
And Kevin, I wanted to follow up with the national Mesonet because that sounds real exciting. If we could spread this, what you're doing in Oklahoma, across the country, that would be awesome. And I know we're making progress with that. So what's the current status of it? And when do you think we'll be achieving that goal of having a true national Mesonet?
So great question. The national Mesonet is getting as much funding as we've ever gotten, which is a testament to the value that there is, because the National Weather Service and the federal government, it's almost unanimously supported in U.S. House and Senate. That is very difficult to achieve, by the way. At this point in time, is some sort of unanimous consensus on some sort of bill. That just doesn't happen. But my goodness gracious, I cannot thank Congressman Lucas enough here in Oklahoma, because he sees the value nationally. Yes, he's an Oklahoman. Yes, he's a rancher. He sees the value of the Mesonet, but he wants everybody to have one too. So there's now funding pouring into over 24 states to help them along with things like calibration and sighting and instruments and that kind of stuff. And I would hope that by the next 10 years or so, that we've got all 50 states with a Mesonet.
That would be lovely. I hear Maryland is next.
Yes.
Here on our side of the Potomac, I'm not sure what the status is. I think we have a long way to go to start securing funding for doing that kind of work here in Virginia. But we've got a big bay, we've got a lot of mountains, we got a lot of valleys, we got coastal plains, we got all that stuff. I would love a Mesonet in Virginia. But back to
Maryland's great guns right now. So
I know they are. Back to calibration real quick. Recently, we were under the big heat dome, of course, across the middle part of the country. A lot of the corn is in bloom in the corn belt. We've seen some exceedingly high heat, but also very high humidity. And there's been a little buzz on why is it so humid? The part of that is what we call corn sweat, which I'd like you to explain when you can. But is there any other kind of calibration issue that we're concerned about generally with instrumentation when we're trying to figure out humidity?
Right. And man, humidity is so hard. Temperature is easy in comparison. It really is. And the reason why moisture measurements are so hard is because moisture measurements in many instances are so dominated sometimes by what's coming up out of the ground. So moisture at low levels, yes, you can have, humid air moving in from somewhere else, off of a bay, off of a lake, off of a stream, whatever it is. But at the same time, if you had rain in the past week, and how summertime rain is, right? It rains across the street, but not at your house. Well, that means that that green lawn across the street is going to transpire moisture into the atmosphere locally there that you're not going to have in your yard because you didn't get rain, so it's still brown. And so if I put a dew point sensor or a relative humidity sensor in that yard versus my yard, I'm going to get two dramatically different readings. So siting is also a huge issue as it pertains to moisture, because moisture variability in soil is so high. If it's a clay soil, you get different moisture profile than a sandy soil. And in Oklahoma, we've got some sensors that are, that far apart. And we get dramatically different because, well, it's a little sandier here and it's a little more clay here. But just above that, that means that the dew point will actually be different. So wherever your moisture sensor happens to be, that's what it's going to register. So in many instances, sometimes with our dew point and relative humidity sensors, we do get a lot of local variation involved in that reading, much like we talked about earlier with the bank temperature and the field temperature and those things. Now, you mentioned calibration. Huge. Do you calibrate your moisture sensors against temperature? You can calibrate them in a chamber and change the relative humidity, and that's one thing. But are you also calibrating the moisture sensors, and do they perform the same way when it's 110 as they do when it's 30? And so, again, going to great lengths to calibrate across the multitudes of parameters that you would see, and does your sensor work in all of those situations? And I know with like many of our backyard things, man, the humidity sensor goes off the rails when it gets really, really hot. And that has nothing to do with the moisture sensor, but the moisture sensor is getting really hot. And when it gets really hot, it doesn't measure the same way anymore. So you have to be careful, again. And moisture, like I said, it is so difficult because of the variability, because of rainfall variability. And heck, once it rains, well, where does all the water go? The water flows downhill or soaks in, or depending upon the soil, creates a puddle in your yard. Well, depending upon where I put that moisture sensor, I'm going to see those differences on a local scale. And, like we saw with the heat index in Lawrence, Kansas, just the other day, which was actually a kind of a national sensor there.
Mm-hmm.
But it's on a gravel parking lot. Okay, that's almost no different than me going out to the football field with 177, right? If you don't play football on a gravel parking lot, you are going to get really high temperature values, therefore really high heat index values. We struggle with irrigation. You mentioned corn sweat, right? If we have, in fact, we just flagged a bunch of data because we noticed in our pictures, and we take pictures every time we go to a site, that we had corn encroaching on our site a little bit closer than it had in the past. So we actually flagged that data because we know it's corn doing the same thing we do when we get hot. We perspire, corn does the same thing, and does it a lot, and you get Iowa and Illinois with those massively high dew points because of the cornfields, as well as downstream, right? So if wind blows that air downstream, then you see that there as well. So it's, we have an irrigation problem now. I mean, if somebody's watering next door and it blows into your yard, well, your moisture sensor is going to see that. So I remember back in the day, right? I grew up in Austin, Texas. And so the National Weather Service was sitting at the end of the runway at the old airport in Austin. Well, that's where the sensor was. Every time a plane took off, you could see it because it was in the jet wash. Every time they watered the golf course across the street and we had southerly winds, you saw it, because now Austin has this massive heat index because of jet wash and golf course irrigation, right? And those are combining literally over the sensor. So again, you have to be cognizant about your location. Again, that's, we try to control that in the Mesonet by where we put things.
So I have two more questions for you. One of them, you just mentioned you're from Austin. I noticed you graduated from UT. Does everyone at OU give you a little slack for that?
Not a little.
A lot, to say the least.
That is the understatement of the year. Yes. So
And
in fact, I don't mean to interrupt, but this is the story about my becoming director of the climate survey. I had been working at OU for a pretty good period of time. My email address, longhorn@ou.edu. And of course, everybody was giving me grief, and a lot of grief. And so when I went through the interview process, they said, well, Kevin, climate, that's a, you don't use that word in Oklahoma, right? Those are You're too nice. How are you going to be able to take all the heat, all the criticism? And in my interview, I simply said, I'm a Longhorn grad in Norman, right? They can't heap on any more abuse than I have already taken. They all start laughing and they're like, okay, your job, you know, you have the job. So yeah, it's been a funny thing around here, but it's hilarious sometimes.
Oh, I bet. The other thing I was going to ask you too, you mentioned earlier about the Mesonet turning 30 next year. Can you just briefly explain why that is such a big deal for us here in the weather world?
So in the weather world, 30 years has significance. We have kind of looked at 30 years as a generation, and back in the agricultural days when climate was really something that was important to agricultural growers and things like that, there was a sort of a group of people got together and said, you know what, 30 years is going to be our benchmark for how we determine climatology. So our averages are all 30-year averages, whether that's rainfall, whether that's temperature, whatever the case may be. So against the background of people using 30 years as their standard for climatology, we become the first, Oklahoma becomes the first regional statewide network with 30 years of data. And so therefore we will have the most detailed look at a climatology in Oklahoma than anywhere else in the world. And that will give researchers the opportunity to do things for decades with the data that we provide.
And Kevin, I like your Longhorn pride because I went to UT as well.
Hey!
So I'm glad that you're sticking it out in Norman. Man, that is got to be tough. I cannot imagine the grief.
It is not easy.
Especially around OU weekend. And before we wrap up, the last thing I want to get your opinion on and kind of inform people about, because one of the things I see the most common when people are talking about how hot is, like when friends, now that I'm in Chicago, are sharing me the temperatures back in Texas, the most common thing I see is people taking pictures of the thermometer in their car and showing that reading. And it's usually a very ridiculously high reading, but there's a pretty big flaw with those temperature readings in cars, correct? And what is that flaw, and what should people be watching out for and kind of take with a grain of salt when it comes to those car thermometers?
I'm not advocating distracted driving, first of all. So you shouldn't be paying attention to that thermometer anyway. Hopefully those pictures were all taken at a red light or a stop sign. But at the same time, if you've ever driven around, you know that when you start driving, that temperature value goes down. And when you stop, the temperature value goes back up again. And so where that thermometer is mounted on your vehicle, when you have ventilation, right, when you have air going by, you're getting more of a feel for what the air temperature is outside, but you're still exposed to the pavement temperature, the engine temperature, and all of those kinds of things. When you stop, that's when that temperature skyrockets. Because of where it's mounted on the vehicle, you are now contributing from the engine, from the hot pavement. In fact, if you want to try this at home, go drive blacktop versus sort of a gravel road versus sort of a parking lot that's white or a lighter color, and you'll see dramatic differences even in the same town on your vehicle's thermometer, again, based upon location, and where you've put that thermometer. So yeah, those are totally unrealistic, although it's real from a standpoint of what that portion of the car is feeling, right? I mean, that is the temperature at that spot. So if you put a thermometer on your dashboard, and of course, the other popular thing is to put cookies up there as well, right? And bake your cookies in the dash. You can actually get partially baked cookies from a car because it does get hot enough to do that. So, if you want to make good use of that, that's another good thing to do. Just don't do it while you're driving.
All right, Dr. Kloesel, thank you so much for joining us. We really enjoyed having you on this week.
Absolutely, my pleasure. It was great to be here. Great to see all of you.
Looking beyond the atmosphere, here's Tony Rice with your Astronomy Outlook.
Where will you be for the total eclipse on April 8, 2024? Now, whether you plan to be in the path of totality, and I totally recommend it, or be watching with eclipse glasses from your backyard, now's a good time to make sure you'll actually be able to see the eclipse. And I'm not talking about clouds. That's always going to be a factor, which we of course can't predict this far in advance. But you can tell if there's going to be a tree or a building blocking your view over the next couple of weeks. First, go to tinyurl.com/2024 eclipse map, and then click on your location. The pop-up will give you the times of the beginning and end of the partial eclipse, along with that point of greatest eclipse, right there in the middle. Now, keep in mind that all these times are in UTC, so be sure to change to your time zone. Next, go outside during the end of August and into the first week of September at that time of greatest eclipse. And be sure to bring along those eclipse glasses that you've saved since 2017 and test them out. If there's a tree in the way this week or next, it will also block your view of the eclipse in April. Now you can repeat this for the start and end times as well to make sure that you can see the entire eclipse. And this is all accurate within a couple of degrees. The absolute best time to check this out will be September 1st, when the sun will be within less than a degree of where it will be on April 8th. Now this trick will also work for the upcoming annular eclipse on October 14th. This time get your timings from tinyurl.com/2023 eclipse map and begin looking on October 1st. The sun's path through the sky will be within about 5 degrees of its path on October 14th. And about those eclipse glasses, be sure to check them out before using them, especially if they've been stuck in a junk drawer for 6 years. If you find them creased or torn, replace them. Your eyesight is too precious to gamble with, and I wouldn't wait either. We're less than 50 days away from that annular eclipse, so we could see a rush on glasses in the coming weeks. And a question I get a lot from those who remembered the market being flooded with dangerous counterfeit eclipse glasses is, where are some safe sources? Well, the American Astronomical Society has you covered there. Visit eclipse.aas.org and click on Eye Safety for lots of great information about testing your glasses and also sources for new ones. That's your Astronomy Outlook. Follow me at RTP Hokie for more spacey stuff like this.
All right, great interview with Dr. Kloesel. You know, he really knows his stuff, and I love how he explains things too. You can definitely tell he's a professor because he kind of gets into it in a way that you can understand, I'd say. But, you know, it's neat to hear all the stuff that he's working on. He's a very busy man, from, you know, working with OU to the Mesonet. He was talking about working with drum corps engineers earlier when we were talking with him off of camera. But, you know, it's good just to get kind of the background on all of this, because I think a lot of people just don't understand how much goes into it, from the calibration and everything, just to the environment being right for a temperature to take reading.
Yeah, it's very tricky. It's a little more complex than we might like. You can get a general idea without very high end calibration, but when we start doing long-term studies and we're trying to get high precision information, calibration, location, all those stuff's so important.
Yeah, and I just like how he, debunked the car thermometers, because people love those car thermometers, but those high temperature readings, I mean, that's just coming off the pavement. But he talked about, it's kind of alarming, like you got that 170-degree temperature off a football field. I mean, the surface that you measure a temperature over matters so much, and so that's why you have to keep that in mind. He talked about location when it comes to taking these temperature readings, and that's very much true. But the alarming thing is, like, those can actually be, again, there's some debate about how calibrated the thermometers are, but it is true that it is going to be hotter over pavement. That comes back to the whole urban heat island effect. That's why cities are hotter than areas in the country. If you have a lot of pavement and blacktop, it is going to be hotter. But for accurate temperature reasons, it should be over a natural ground surface, a grass surface, because otherwise the temperatures are going to be hotter. So take that with a grain of salt. If you see these really high temperature readings in your car and it doesn't match what the meteorologist on TV or on your favorite weather app is saying, that's why, because it's a temperature right off of the pavement. And so that temperature is likely going to be hotter than the real official temperature that's going to be recorded in the city that day.
Yeah, it was funny how he was talking about, what was it, in Austin with the golf course, watering the lawn. If there's a south wind, you could see the dew point go up. I mean, there's a lot of variables into what goes into a temperature reading, but the calibration is key, like he said. And also, too, I mean, shout out to them for keeping this going for 30 years, because, it does take a lot of commitment to showing value to stakeholders. Of course, people in the political world who are, providing funding for this. So to get this in Oklahoma and for a number of states is incredible. And I think, just as a consumer of weather, you want to know what's happening. Oh, what's happening in my house, right? That's always the thing, right? So the Mesonet is a step closer to telling you, oh, this is exactly what's happening at my house. So if you think about it that way, it's definitely something that's beneficial for every state, that has it across the country. And maybe the national one comes too.
Yeah. No,
I'm looking forward to that day.
I know. Let's hope for that. You know, a couple things before we wrap up here. Joe said it earlier, but we want to say thank you to Deidre for writing in and you know, sparking this topic. Joe, if people want to get in touch with us, tell us a couple of ways they can do that.
So you can email podcast@lee.net if you want to check out or send us an email about what's going on. That's great too. We also have a voicemail line that we would love to hear you from. I'm going to stall for the next 5 seconds while I pull up that phone number because I forgot it off the top of my head. But if you do want to give a call and try to figure out what's going on or ask us a question, whether it's, you know, about climate or weather or, you know, something about us and what we're doing in the weather world, you can give us a call at 609-272-7099. So it's 609-272-7099. That's very close to my work line number. So if you dial a digit or two, you might even get me directly. But there you go. You can give us an email or you can shoot us a phone call as well, whatever works.
Awesome. And you know what? Next week, kind of pitching ahead to what you can expect for next week's release, we sat down and we spoke with Sally Warner from Brandeis University and Noel Gutierrez Wizuela from UC San Diego. And the two of them have some really interesting information on the warming that's going on in the deeper ocean currents, and it's all happening from hurricanes. I mean, it's something that's naturally occurring from hurricanes, but it's really quite fascinating. It was a great interview, so catch that. That'll be released then on September 4th.
Labor Day.
On Labor Day, absolutely. So yeah, Labor Day weekend. Hope everyone enjoys it. All right, thanks again for joining us this week from Across the Sky Podcast. I'm Kirsten Lang in Tulsa with Sean Sublett, Matt Holliner, and Joe Martucci. Have a wonderful week and stay safe.